The ideological roots of cynicism. How the prevailing sense of doom and pessimism is related to partial perspectives. As an election rematch no one wants or asked for looms nearer, one can sense the doom and defeatism in our collective consciousness. If nihilism is a black hole of meaninglessness, then our culture seems to be spiraling around it, unable to escape its force. The meta-crisis. Every problem, from climate change to misinformation to economic plutocracy, is a crisis of global proportions, which our institutions are unable to even begin to address. This is like a buzzing dissonance in the background of our everyday lives. We struggle to create a meaningful existence, but there is an inevitable hollowness when we know that the top of our social economic structure is full of craven fools and villains. Combined with the bitterness of intractable political ideological divisions, there is a sense of helplessness. What can I, as but one individual person, do about this? Certainly, we are more isolated, depressed, and cynical than ever, and this cannot be blamed solely on social media addiction and misinformation. We do not suffer from post-truth so much as an overdose of truth, a hyper-awareness of things we don't necessarily want to hear or are ready to accept. Alternative facts, political extremism, and conspiracy theory do not come out of nowhere. They are a response, a defense mechanism against an excess of truth and reality, simplifying it in narrative form so that a generalized sense of threat can be pinned down to one or a few underlying causes. The consequences can be grim for those who serve as the scapegoats, so it is understandable that conspiracy theories are stigmatized, and some of them are, of course, absurd. But at the same time, counter-establishment narratives, even when they are mostly false, also highlight some actual truths which the mainstream of liberal rationalist thought is unable to accept or process. The most pertinent of these uncomfortable truths is that the institutions which mainstream liberals and conservatives defend overwhelmingly serve the elite, whether that is defined in economic or social terms. You can laugh at the flat earthers all you want, but the true equivalent of flat earth today is believing that our institutions aren't broken and don't need radical rethinking from the bottom up. So you see, our pessimism is misdiagnosed. It seems like we can't get anything done because they, our political opponents, will not meet us here in reality and truth, so that we can form the consensus necessary to push forward. Instead, it appears that they are blocking our every move, so that we cannot address any aspect of the political problem, whatever we understand that to consist of. But what we cannot process is that the crisis is multidimensional, in a way that is beyond the capacity of any particular ideology to grasp in thought form. What we view as a failure to solve the problem, a failure to address it in a way we see fit according to our ideology, leading ultimately to pessimism, is actually the ideological failure to conceive the problem correctly in the first place. Once we realize this, I believe that the sense of doom will loosen its grip on us, being a consequence not so much of the problem itself and its intractability, but coming from the way we are viewing the problem ideologically. As philosopher Slavoj Žižek says, the ideological divide consists in how the ideological divide itself is conceived of. Broadly speaking, the ideologies of the left are centered around care and the reduction of harm and suffering, while the ideologies of the right are centered around preserving existing norms and values endorsed by a group we identify with. The left's ethic of care finds itself in conflict with the norms of society, which does not operate on that principle, but instead on established ways of doing things, whether that is tradition on one hand, or the pragmatic concerns of profit and governance on the other. The demands of universal justice and respect for all people are often either inconvenient for the powers that be, just not a concern, or in direct opposition to their interests. So the left focuses its efforts on overturning conventional values, for example, gender, family, religion, nation, and of course, the right finds this threatening because those are what it wants to defend. From its perspective, the left is the authoritarian power, suppressing the natural order. they are the 1984 thought police. Whereas from the left perspective, the right are the 1984 thought police, suppressing how people naturally want to express their bodies and identities. The intense partisan divide between left and right means that we have two incompatible ideologies, which each define societal crisis differently according to the values they hold sacred. While any problem stemming from opposite values is de-emphasized, minimized, and ultimately gaslit, a tactic of abuse, which of course is a terrible way to maintain any kind of relationship. It appears that all forces which would push us in the direction of true progress, if only we could agree on what that is, are canceled out, negated by the equal and opposite reaction from the other side. How could we see anything in our future but civil war? War is politics by other means, when we have exhausted all conciliatory efforts. My side is right, yours is wrong, and if you won't go willingly into the dustbin of history, then we're going to have to physically shove you in there. Echoes of 19th and 20th century reverberate here. What if there is another possibility, though? What if both sides are wrong, and both sides are right also? This may appear to be naive both-sidesism, but I'm not trying to draw a false moral equivalence in all particular situations. For example, the Charlottesville situation in 2017, how Trump tried to portray the situation in which one side is clearly more in the wrong. I'm not even trying to make a claim that in general both sides are morally equivalent. I'm saying rather that both have a distinct moral perspective which is not in itself inherently more valid than the other, and which can in principle be complementary if taken in good faith. In practice, there have been nationalist communist movements and communal nationalist movements, and this is not a contradiction, except to those who insist on absolute ideological purity, and they're the ones you have to watch out for. Seeing the world only through the lens of humanitarian and environmental concern, the lens in which suffering and destruction are paramount, is morally righteous, but in assuming the seat of judgment on all that is, all that exists, isn't there an inherent arrogance there, a mistaken faith in the capacity of human reason to understand things not only how they are, but how they ought to be? And this is totally incontrovertible with the perspective of the demonized enemies of progress, having no possible input on what progress could mean. What if the problem as formulated from the left is fundamentally partial, incomplete, because it cannot conceive of how the left itself is part of the problem? The very self-identity as radicals for progress includes an anti-democratic premise, the mistaken belief that the arc of history bends towards the left, towards one's own ideological preferences, which is self-evidently absurd. Where do you even begin with psychoanalyzing the massive ego of someone who believes themselves to truly be the savior of all humankind, the earth, and everything on it? The radical left stands on their enormous stacks of books, written by Marxists and critical theorists, looking down on the poor, unenlightened masses and pretending to be an authority on everything wrong with everyone around them, while confidently ignoring the age-old philosophical wisdom of know thyself. Conversely, seeing the world through the lens of the values and norms which happen to be the ones present at this moment in time and in this geographical location and with this particular upbringing you had, predisposing you to those norms and values so that they seem natural and right, i.e. the status quo, isn't that enormously short-sighted and cheap? The right claims to defend the Enlightenment Western tradition, including, I suppose, everything from ancient Rome and Greece to Renaissance art, Kant, and Newton, but excluding the French Revolution. But it apparently has devoted very little thought to questioning anything about the world around it, only to questioning those who question it, which is a false, reactionary intellectualism, unworthy of Socrates, Aquinas, George Washington, Caesar, Napoleon, or whoever it is that they revere. Surely, for those great figures of the past, their greatness would extend to not embracing a victimhood narrative where the left and troublesome minorities are the cause of all the world's ills, and whiteness is somehow under attack, on the verge of extinction, despite being the preeminent power for hundreds of years, to the point of enslaving and oppressing people who look different, the radical right is nothing more than woke identity politics for white people, co-opted from the left because it has no original ideas and nothing to offer in the way of actual solutions to actual problems. There is value in tradition, but if there is no scope within that tradition to adapt to new realities and new members of the group with different identities and perspectives, then it is weak and fragile and is not worth defending. Only a living tradition has the vitality which is amenable to greatness, and the latter has always been about bending the rules anyway. Your quasi-fascism is not rebellious, it is just following orders and should be judged the same. It cannot be the case that there are only two possibilities. Either the problems we face are defined entirely from a view towards a more utopian and egalitarian future, or they are defined from a view towards a mythical past of greatness. This is illogical on the face of it, since as beings existing in time, we both anticipate the future and remember the past in order to understand ourselves and where we're going. The extreme partisans of left and right want us to believe their preferred story, but the actual story that makes sense is that their stories make no sense. And the extreme partisanship that defines our current era is a reflection on the inadequacies of these ideologies, just as much as they reflect actual problems in the world that need to be addressed. These partial narratives, partial to a particular set of values, which can never be universal, are a legacy of our past, entering into a crisis in the present moment, and are destined to unravel and lose all legitimacy in the very near future. A new ideology, which is equally comfortable in the modes of egalitarian universalism and exceptional individualism, despite the apparent contradiction, must and will arise to replace the old ideologies, not Marx or Nietzsche, but both Marx and Nietzsche, and innumerable others who have valuable insights, because philosophy is not limited to what Europeans thought between the years 1800 and 1900. The problems pointed to by the old ideologies do not disappear by any means. They are definitely real, but real in a different way, a way that takes on a new meaning, which places these problems in the true context of the entirety of the human and non-human experience. This will illuminate the path forward for all of us, beyond petty partisan loyalties and fetishes attached to viewing the world in the old ways. It will illuminate the past also, in showing what we need to hold on to and what we need to change. The doom and pessimism is a temporary symptom of a fractured age. And the solution is in the mirror, the broken and fractured mirror, which distorts our perception of ourselves and which we merely need to piece together in order to pierce through both the establishment and the counter-establishment lies and deceptions. The false notion that we have already perceived the problem correctly, but there is no hope in achieving right action to address it, will be dissolved because actually no, we have not perceived it correctly. And that's why our quote-unquote action is doomed to failure and negation by those who perceive the exact opposite. They have a piece of the truth, just as much as you have a piece of it, and only a piece, a shard. Maybe try talking to and learning from those who see differently, so that we can have some hope of productively working together to solve our many problems, rather than trying to stab them to death with your little shard of the truth.